Hello, and welcome to Better Everyday Studio. I'm Alina. Today's episode is inspired by an idea from Justin Sung, the learning coach and YouTuber, whose work on learning efficiency has helped a lot of people rethink how they study, process information, and build real understanding. In particular, we're exploring his idea of thinking on paper and the powerful framework behind it. Make it wrong, make it shorter, make it again. If you've ever read a book, highlighted page after page, filled notebooks with notes, and still felt like none of it really clicked, this episode is for you. Because today, we're talking about how to learn faster without just studying longer. Not by cramming harder, not by rereading more, and definitely not by making prettier notes. We're talking about how to actually understand what you learn. And that matters because most people are not short on information. They're short on structure. They consume, they collect, they capture, but they never fully organize. And without structure, knowledge stays slippery. It doesn't become usable. It doesn't become intuitive. It doesn't become part of how you think. So in this episode, I want to take Justin Sung's core idea and turn it into something practical and powerful for an audio listener. Something you can use whether you're learning psychology, finance, coding, medicine, or simply trying to think more clearly at work and in life. Let's get into it. Why so much learning doesn't stick. Here's the experience so many people know. You watch the video, you read the chapter, you take notes, you feel productive, and then later, when you try to explain the idea to someone else, or worse, when you actually need to use it, your mind goes blank. Why does that happen? Because a lot of what we call learning is really just information transfer. We move words from a screen to a notebook, from a lecture to an app, from a textbook into a highlighted page. But that's not the same as understanding. When too much information is being managed only in your head, your brain starts to feel like a browser with 30 tabs open, all playing at once. That overload creates confusion, anxiety, and what a lot of people would simply call cognitive overload. And when people hit that point, they usually do something that looks productive, but often makes the problem worse. They start taking even more notes. Not thinking notes, not selective notes, just more notes. But as Justin Sung's idea suggests, there's a difference between recording information and processing information. If you're just copying ideas down, your brain may feel reassured, but it may not actually be organizing, compressing, or understanding anything. That's the shift this episode is about. Paper is not just a storage device for your conclusions. It can be a workspace for your thinking. What thinking on paper actually means. So what does it mean to think on paper? Imagine being handed a giant box of puzzle pieces. If you try to assemble that puzzle entirely in your head, it's exhausting. There are too many moving parts, too many possible patterns, too many relationships to hold at once. But once you dump the puzzle pieces onto a table, something changes. Now you can move them, group them, test them, rearrange them, see edges and clusters. Learning a new subject is like receiving a pile of puzzle pieces. And thinking on paper is what happens when you stop trying to juggle them mentally and start laying them out where you can work with them. That's why this method is so useful. Because learning is not about collecting isolated facts. It's about building relationships between ideas. And when those relationships stay invisible, learning feels slow and frustrating. When those relationships become visible, understanding speeds up. That's where Justin Sung's framework comes in. Make it wrong. Make it shorter. Make it again. Let's walk through each one. Step 1. Make 8 wrong. This first step might be the most freeing part of the whole method. Your first version should be messy. It should be incomplete. And yes, it should probably be wrong. Because when people learn something new, they often want their notes to look smart before their thinking is actually clear. They want clean categories, airtight logic, beautiful structure, perfect wordings. But perfectionism can become a form of avoidance. Instead of exploring the idea, you start managing appearances. Instead of thinking, you start formatting. If you try to be correct too early, you may be doing what feels like learning without doing the cognitive work of organizing knowledge. It even describes this as a kind of fake learning. So instead, start by getting the pieces out. When you're learning something new, say psychology, your notes might start out as nothing more than scattered fragments. Trauma response, defense mechanism, self-worth, people-pleasing, boundaries, shame, emotional flashback, inner child. No perfect sentences. No clean hierarchy. Just raw pieces on a page. Then your brain does what it naturally does. It starts guessing. Maybe shame triggers certain defense mechanisms. Maybe low self-worth fuels people-pleasing. Maybe weak boundaries tie into attachment patterns. Maybe emotional flashbacks connect to inner child wounds. Are those connections fully correct yet? Maybe not. But that's the point. Because the goal of the first pass isn't to be right. It's to start modeling. When you guess, compare, connect, and test, your brain begins building structure. That's the moment that learning stops being passive and becomes active. Step 1 gives you permission to stop trying to look intelligent and start trying to think. Step 2, make it shorter. Once the ideas are out on paper, most people assume the next move is to add more detail. Justin Sung's framework says the opposite. Make it shorter. This is where real understanding gets tested. Because long explanation can hide fuzzy thinking. A paragraph can sound impressive while still being mentally vague. But when you force yourself to compress an idea into a few key terms, you expose whether you actually understand it. The more words in your notes, the shallower your understanding often is. The challenge is to compress a long explanation into a few words or core concepts. Let's say you're trying to figure out why you always feel sleepy in the afternoon. You could write a long explanation about blood sugar, caffeine metabolism, poor sleep, lunch size, and inactivity. Or you could reduce it to this: sugar crash, caffeine rebound, sleep debt, heavy lunch, sedentary slump. When you compress information, something interesting happens. Thinking suddenly gets easier. It invites sharper questions. Is the real problem lunch or the sleep debt behind it? Is coffee solving the issue or creating the rebound? Is food the culprit, or is it the fact that you've been in a sedentary slump for 4 straight hours? That's what compression does. It doesn't just shorten the note. It sharpens the mind. Because this process, filtering, distilling, reducing too much language into a few essential concepts, is cognitively demanding. And that's exactly why it works. When you compress, your brain is forced to compare, select, and extract. Those mental operations are what turns scattered information into actual understanding. It's the moment knowledge stops floating around your head and finally starts to stick. So if you want deeper understanding, ask yourself, can I say this in fewer words? Can I reduce this to the levers that actually matter? Can I make this impossible to misunderstand? Very often, better thinking begins with fewer words. Step 3. Make it again. Now we get to the third step, and this is where understanding becomes durable. Make it again, not by rereading the same messy page, not by endlessly highlighting what you already wrote, but by rebuilding the whole thing from scratch. Once you realize your original notes are too messy or that some of your connections were wrong, don't just patch the old page. Take a new sheet and redraw the model. Why does that matter? Because true clarity often doesn't come from editing confusion. It comes from reorganizing confusion. Think of it like sorting clothes. At first, everything is thrown on the bed. That's the messy first pass. Then you separate shirts, pants, jackets, basics. Now you've got structure. Then you realize jackets should be divided again. Formal, casual, light, heavy. Now you've got a more refined model. Each round of reorganization leads to a better structure, not just a prettier page. And you can see this even more clearly in something like planning a road trip. At first, your notes are random. Hotels, gas stops, scenic viewpoints, car rental, restaurants. Then suddenly you realize the core issue is geography and route timing. So you start over with a new layout built around the actual backbone of the trip. The new version is not just neater. It reflects understanding. And that's the point. You are not learning by seeing the same notes again. You are learning by reconstructing the logic. Eventually, even if you lose the paper, the structure stays in your mind. That's when you know the knowledge is becoming yours. Why this method works across so many areas. What makes this method so powerful is that it's not limited to academic study. It works for anything complex. If you're learning finance, you're trying to see relationships. If you're learning coding, you're trying to see systems. If you're learning psychology, you're trying to see patterns. If you're solving a work problem, you're trying to see leverage points. In all of those cases, the challenge is the same. You are trying to grasp structure inside complexity. And that's exactly what thinking on paper helps you do. This method helps you see structure faster, understand faster, identify key problems faster, and reduce repeated learning time. In other words, it doesn't just help you remember more, it helps you think more effectively. And maybe just as importantly, it changes your emotional relationship with learning. Instead of seeing confusion as proof that you're bad at the topic, you start seeing confusion as the raw material of understanding. Mess stops being failure. Mess becomes the first draft of clarity. That shift alone can make you more resilient, more patient, and a lot less intimidated by difficult subjects. So let's make this practical. Pick one thing you're trying to learn right now. Maybe it's a course lesson, a work challenge, a chapter from a book, a health habit, a business idea, a relationship pattern. Now walk it through these 3 rounds. Round 1. Make it wrong, dump the concepts onto paper. Use fragments. Use arrows. Use guesses. Use ugly notes if you have to. Your job is not to be polished. Your job is to get the pieces out. Round 2. Make it shorter now. Compress everything. What are the few terms, tensions, or mechanisms that actually matter here? Take the long explanation and force it into clarity. Round 3. Make it again. Put the first page aside. Take a fresh page. Rebuild the idea around what now feels central. That last step is where ownership happens. The first round captures exposure. The second round forces extraction. The third round builds internal structure. And once you have structure, you can use what you know. If there's one idea I want you to take from today, it's this. Learning is not the act of collecting information. It's the act of organizing meaning. And that's why Justin Sung's idea is so useful. Thinking on paper gives your mind a place to work, a place to test, a place to fail safely, a place to turn overload into structure. So the next time you feel overwhelmed by a complex subject, don't ask, how do I memorize all of this? Ask, what is the structure here? And how can I build it outside my head? That question can change the way you learn forever. That's it for today's episode of Better Everyday Studio. I'm Alina, and if this episode helped you rethink the way you learn, reflect, or solve problems, make sure you subscribe and come back for the next one. And before we go, full credit where it's due. Today's episode was inspired by Justin Sung and his approach to learning, especially the idea of thinking on paper and the framework. Make it wrong, make it shorter, make it again. Thanks for listening. And until next time, keep getting better every day.